Everyone, thank you for joining. Just getting everything set up. I am Yossi Goslin, NBA salary cap analyst. March has been quite a busy month for me, just as far as starting to build out my salary cap sheets for the 26-27 season. Oh my God. So now I am been a little busy with that. Haven't been able to do much media stuff recently, but now I've been able to have some time and I am back. And one of the first teams I want to talk about heading into the offseason is the Spurs. I have a lot of questions about them, but they're also a team whose outlook I am particularly high and strong about. And I decided to bring in one of the top guys covering the Spurs. You can find his work on the Vic and Roll newsletter and podcast that features a lot of film studies on the Spurs. Noah Magaro-George. Noah, thanks for being on, and how are you doing?
I'm great. And first off, thank you so much for bringing me on. I'm happy to hear that you like my work. I'm happy to hear that you think the Spurs outlook is good because I feel the same way and I'm ready to talk about San Antonio Spurs.
Yeah. Usually whenever you do a podcast, a lot of people, they start chatting a little bit about what they're about to chat about, but then you want to save it for later. And the one thing I was just getting into, and then I wanted to save it was, it's very unfortunate what happened to Victor Wembanyama. And hopefully he's going to be okay. He'll be able to play through. It doesn't have any more hiccups like this. I'm confident that that's pretty much going to be the case. That's what a lot of the reporting seems to indicate early on. But then the follow-up is now that also De'Aaron Fox is out for the year, which that's another tough blow. The Spurs still have a lot of things to try to figure out. They need to see, who's going to fit on this roster, and they need to give Wemby and Fox more minutes. But at the same time, when I put my GM cap on, I also think this is kind of a good thing now that they get to have one last bottoming out with their first round pick and give themselves another high shot at the apple for what's supposed to be a very stacked draft.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to look at this right now. I mean, obviously, losing Victor Wembanyama was really tough for them. As you said, the reporting seems to be that he's going to be fine by next season. De'Aaron Fox thing, I think it's like an 8 to 12 week timeline, so he will be fine for next season. And now you get to see, what does Stephon Castle kind of look like as the 1A and 1B next to Devin Vassell? And what do the other young guys have in the tank? Like can Malachi Branham make a lasting impact here? Can Blake Wesley prove that he deserves a shot? And then the bottoming out thing too. Obviously, you're gonna have a shot at what looks like a top 10 to 7 pick in a really nice draft class, and you'll also have that Atlanta pick. We don't know where that's necessarily going to fall. Hasn't really gone how I think maybe San Antonio wanted it to go, but you get a couple shots or a couple bites at the apple. So I think, San Antonio is probably, all things considered, pretty happy with where they are right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition to get into the first thing I want to get into. And I think you're pretty good, I think you have a good representation opinion for how Spurs fans might feel about how things are going. So I want to just kind of touch on the moves that they made overall last season. Generally, since they've started this rebuild, for the most part, the late teens, early 2020s, they were never really all in on it. They were always still trying to compete, be as good as possible. And if I was a Spurs fan, that would probably, at some point, that would drive me a little crazy that they never really fully committed. And once they did, they got the prospect of prospects. So it all worked out in the end. But overall, I've based on what they've done, if I was a Spurs fan, I'd be thinking why didn't they do this sooner? Because I really like the job they've done. So other than the Fox trade, which we'll get into a little more, that kind of merits its own section. The Spurs have been in asset accumulation mode, as they've been for the past 3-4 seasons. So the first thing they did, they swapped the Dillingham pick for a future Wolves 2031 first round pick. I like that for the Spurs, just given if they were really, they decided they weren't going to do it, they didn't want an extra first round pick. That's, I think, as good an asset you can get for him. Just getting a pick that far out, they were able to do something with that later. They got several more second round picks by taking on some unwanted salaries with their room mid-level. They used that as a trade exception. And then they also got a 2031 Kings swap for taking on Harrison Barnes, who's a really good vet. And if anything, you're going to point out what the Spurs should have done last offseason is add some veterans, and they got like a really great fifth option in Harrison Barnes. And then they also signed Chris Paul. So overall, would you say you were pleased with the moves they've done, with the direction they did? Do you think maybe they should have been a little more aggressive one way or another, whether with the competing or the asset accumulation / bottoming out, or was it just somewhere right in between?
Yeah, and I hate to be a homer here, but I do think it was good, like a good sort of middle ground between those two things. Because one, I don't think, I mean, you look at throughout the history of the NBA, how often do you get that guy who's like the face of your franchise, and then in year 2, year 3, you're winning the title? I think you'll find that happens very rarely. And I think building out slowly, kind of figuring out what you have, adding assets to go have that ammunition to go get a superstar, get a secondary star like a De'Aaron Fox, and of course we'll talk about that later. But doing those sort of things, that's big to me. But also bringing in like the adults in the room, so to speak, like Chris Paul, guys like Harrison Barnes, that's also really big for San Antonio, because I think before things sort of started going downhill post, All-Star break with the Wembenyama news, Fox has now been put on the shelf. Obviously the pop thing in November sort of put a dampener on the season a bit. That it looked like they were at least going to be in that play-in range, and I think that's a good place for them to be. Where if you make the play-in, great. You're kind of playing with house money. You're not expected to win the title. You're not necessarily expected to make the playoffs. But if you do, great. You get that play-in experience. You maybe get the playoff experience, and that's not going to happen anymore. But I really think had these other things maybe not happened like they happened, I'm pretty happy with the moves given the context that we had when they happened. So I think it is really big for them, and not just Wembenyama, but also all the other young souls, adults in the organization, show you what it's like to be a professional, on and off the court. So I've been very happy with the moves that they've made while still maintaining that future flexibility, and I think that's the biggest key, is that future flexibility.
Yeah, to the point about the lead up to getting Wemby, it feels like the basketball gods they did things right by the basketball gods, where they didn't force anything. Everything felt pretty natural for the most part about the way they went about the process. Some teams are aggressively bottoming out now. See the Raptors, they're like playing their starters only like 20 minutes a game, 25 minutes a game now. We'll see how that turns out for them. But it did feel like very natural, and like out of all the locations, the other teams he possibly could have gone to, this was like as best as it, like for him, I think it could have been a situation wise. But as far as like, yeah, the veterans, I just feel like what they did last offseason was like just kind of like the perfect mix of bringing vets. You bring in a guy like Chris Paul, it just made so much sense. The year before, Wemby wasn't getting the ball enough, so that was the whole joke. And now they got Chris Paul who's going to keep feeding him. So, and he was a guy that I thought for a second might once Wemby and Fox got injured, maybe he might want to ask for a buyout, but he stuck around because then, like, in a way, you can say his purpose there kind of got served. But I kind of get the feeling that they want to bring him back next year if they're keeping him now, even though their season's lost. So I think that's pretty good, especially when, and we'll get into what they're going to do next, but they definitely need a backup point guard, so he would fit that bill. Like I mentioned, Harrison Barnes, I think that trade was a miscalculation by the Kings, going from Barnes to DeRozan, giving up that asset to get him, just because like Harrison Barnes, I think is like severely undervalued, but he's like the best last option you can possibly put in a lineup. There's obviously better guys than him that you can have, but he's as good as you can get given the price and the position. And the other thing though is just the Spurs don't have like the biggest surplus of picks. They don't have the most first round picks. I know they have like a lot of second round picks, but I think that they have one of the better quality of selections in their surplus, where they had that Wolves pick. I really like that. They got these Hawks picks. They like did an incredible job in the DeJounte Murray negotiation, getting these picks right around Trae Young's free agency. One of them's already looking like a mid first round pick. That's still pretty good. and just like the variance of what the next two could be, that makes them super valuable, which leaves them with a lot of possibilities for what they can do over the next year and a half. And yeah, like that Raptors pick they got for Jakob Pertl, they know how to get like very high quality ones. And I think along with that Wolves pick, which they parlayed in the Fox, that Kings 31 swap, that might be something. I know a lot of swaps don't convey, but even like you got 6 years to do something with it. Maybe you can flip that into something else. So overall, I think, yeah, it was the perfect mix where they didn't get too many assets, but they got the right amount of the right veterans, and then they got like just great quality future picks that they're going to be able, I think, to do something meaningful with in the near future.
Yeah, and I don't know the exact year off the top of my head, so I could be saying this wrong, but I do think they have like the 2028 swap with the Celtics, which, I don't think the Celtics are going to be really bad by then, but the Spurs could be really, really good by then. So that could, maybe that could be something. And then the 2029 swap, I think that they have with the Mavericks, I think that could be something down the line too. But yeah. So I think they've done a lot of these small calculated moves that maybe at the time Spurs fans were like, what are you doing? Like Brian Wright, we want to see players. We don't want to see picks. We don't want these second rounders. We don't want all these swaps. But I think he's sort of been very good at looking long term rather than getting these sort of immediate gratification moves where you get incrementally better, but doesn't really help you that much. So I've been happy with the moves that they've been making. And to your point with Harrison Barnes too, I do want to just shout him out for a moment because he's a guy who has played for Roy Williams. He's been an All-American. He's an NBA champion. He's a guy who has played on several different types of teams and several different types of roles. And so even though, I think Spurs fans saw him coming in this summer and they're like, it's just Harrison Barnes. I think the sort of knowledge that he has and experience that he has and just his personality as well has been really helpful, as I said earlier, just to kind of setting the right example and setting the tone for a lot of these guys. Because I think at this point in the season, it's hard to maybe stay focused and stay motivated. But to me, every game that I've watched, every game that I've seen with Harrison Barnes out there, he seems to be, business as usual. He's ready to stay on track. And I think that's kind of helped some of these other guys who may not have a lot to play for still kind of stay on track as well.
100% agree with that. Harrison Barnes will have these stretches now and then where he just gets on fire. I know early on in the year he had this like really strong stretch. I think November. He does that like every year, with whichever team he's on. And the thing is, when they did that trade, the Kings needed to clear money so they could bring in DeRozan. So it's basically the Spurs had to take on him or Kevin Huerter. And I think like I would imagine the Kings try to push to get him to take Huerter, and the Spurs probably wanted Harrison Barnes. And that's huge because like he was like they got an asset for taking him on, but they got like who I think is a positive player like at the time of the trade and still has proven that he is. And if they go into next season without making any significant changes, like they already have most of their rotation set, they just mainly need to fill out their guard and get a backup big. We'll get into that and maybe see what possibilities that would be. But they already have their core, like their core rotation set up. And if Harrison Barnes is your fifth guy, I think that's enough for this Spurs team once they get more reps in and they're presumably healthy. They'd be able to not only make the playoffs, but maybe make some noise in the first round. So as far as like this current season, which is about to end, and then next year, I think that's just like a very solid value add to have. So let's move on to the next thing. So I'm just looking at their cap sheet for next season. I want to start to get into like what they can potentially do this off season. So I'm looking at their sheet. I can't really show it without blocking one of us. I'm gonna change some features so in future episodes it'll look nicer. But you can view this on capsheets.com. Their 25-26 cap sheet. They already have 12 players under contract. And that includes 2 first-round picks, which I have estimates for where they were going to slot at. I'm slotting their own to be 8th overall. Obviously, they could jump up in the lottery, go up to the top 4. And then I have the Hawks pick at 16th. The Hawks have been pretty solid. I think they're going to make the playoffs, in which case it's going to be like low teens. and they're about 33 million below the tax. But unlike last summer, so they still have a lot of flexibility. They're not going to have cap space. They were projected to have a little bit before the Fox trade, but now that they did that trade, they're not going to. They're unlikely to have any cap space unless they get off some big money. But I don't think they're going to want cap space. Not a lot of guys really to go after, but they will have the non-tax mid-level, which is going to start at like 14 million, which is pretty big. And last year, they, like I mentioned, they used it to take on Jalen McDaniels and Patrick Baldwin Jr. to get some extra second round picks. I would imagine this time they're probably gonna use it to help fill out their bench. And aside from that, they could also increase their payroll with a trade. They have enough flexibility where they can do like a trade where they're taking on a lot more money than they're sending out. So Noah, do you have any goals in mind for how you think the Spurs should go about their offseason? Any players you think they should pursue in particular?
Yeah, so I've got two names in particular. I don't think you're going to be able to get both of them this summer, but if you were able to land one of these two guys, and they're both on the same team right now, I think it would be at least the start to a successful offseason. So I really like Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Think he's a really solid rotation piece. I think he's a pretty major upgrade over, no offense, Julian Champagny or a Malachi Branham or Blake Wesley, but he is a guy who I think has proven he can be that rotation piece, sixth, seventh, eighth guy off the bench. And, he's a good shooter. He's not the best finisher, but he's having the best rim finishing year of his career. He's somewhat reliable as a secondary playmaker. And defensively, I think he's been pretty solid. And he was a pretty solid piece as far as team defensive responsibilities for that team that made it to the West Conference Finals a year ago for the Timberwolves. We'll see what they do this year, but I think he's looked pretty similar to how he did a year ago. I like him a lot. And then Naz Reid. I think Naz Reid is someone who the Spurs should definitely be interested in. I think San Antonio tried the whole stretch big next to Wemby thing. Didn't work out because it was Zach Collins, and Zach Collins, awesome guy. He did a lot of community service stuff. He was a trooper when he got benched, but Zach Collins just is not a floor spacer. I think there was always that idea that he could be a floor spacer, this idea that he could maybe play a little bit of drop coverage and survive like that, but definitely was not an ideal fit next to Wemby. And I don't know that Naz Reid is necessarily the perfect fit next to Wemby, and I'm not saying he has to start if he signs with San Antonio, but I think he's a guy who's definitely interesting and gives you some lineup versatility, some scheme versatility. And if I'm San Antonio, I'm interested in both of those guys. I'm definitely interested in both of those guys. If I can get one of those two as far as free agency goes, I'd be pretty happy.
Okay, so this is definitely a little more ambitious than what I got in mind. And as far you're definitely trying to gut the Wolves, I see. Unfortunately, I see you're trying to build up that 2031 swap, that pick. Fortunately, they already gave it to the Kings. But Nickeil, so as far as some of these top guys in free agency, I'm of the mind right now where I'm kind of thinking lower end of what these guys might end up getting versus what they're actually worth. Because you can look at a guy like Naz Reid. He's a lot of people value him like a $25 million a year guy plus. Nickeil Alexander-Walker.
Yeah, and that's fair.
Yeah, and Alexander Walker's maybe a full mid-level guy and even more than that. You can make a good argument that these guys are worth more than that, but last offseason we saw a lot of good role players not get much. Now, a big part of that had to do not so much with the apron rules, but with how the salary cap only went up by 3%. This year it's going to go up 10%, but at the same time there's even fewer cap space teams. So it's really hard for me to gauge exactly where some of these guys are going to land, but I'm of the mind right now until we get a little more clarity, a little more information, that some of these guys might be getting a little lower than what they deserve. So Nickeil Alexander-Walker right now, I could see that maybe being attainable, especially if they're going to offer most, if not the whole mid-level exception. That might be enough to get him out of Minnesota, where they're trying to keep as many of their players as possible after trading Cat. That was the goal in mind, and they got to go Gobert on a small extension. But maybe there's a way where a team could just offer just enough to make the Wolves a little more uncomfortable about bringing him back on a reserve role. So I could see that happening, and I do like that for the Spurs. especially maybe on a shorter term deal, maybe because Castle kind of projects to be like on the high end, like the kind of player type Alexander Walker would be. So that could help him develop and get him, maybe help him get there. Um, so here's the thing though, if they were going to get a guy like him, and I would say if you can get a guy like Alexander Walker, just get him, worry about the other positions later. Um, but because then you're going to have a hard time getting a big back. Bringing back Chris Paul will be simple. They can just re-sign him. They have enough from his bird rights to bring him back on whatever it's going to take. But it does feel like they're probably going to be deciding between bringing in like the best player possible versus bringing in like a pretty quality big, because I don't think they're going to want to go back into this season with only like maybe the type like Bassi or Mamu or Biombo.
Yeah.
And, teams like bigs are still very valued in this league. We saw that in this trade deadline where there was just such crazy deals happening. Like the big man market kind of was frozen. Like Robert Williams didn't move, Steven Adams didn't move. Like teams are still holding on to their bigs. So I think if you're the Spurs, you definitely need to prioritize bringing a big at the same time, if you can get like a talent like an Alexander Walker, that type of tier, I would say, yeah, do it and worry about getting a big later. They can still do some trades. There's different ways they can go about it. Like if you bring in Alexander Walker, then that makes Brandon a lot more expendable. What can you do? You can bring back like a $10 million center with him. So, yeah, there's definitely ways they could still make it happen to get to bring in like a real difference maker like him, and then fill out those other pieces of the bench. But I like that. I really like getting a player like that. Naz Reid, probably going to take a sign and trade. I don't know if the Wolves would cooperate.
Yeah, that would be a lot. I mean, he's definitely a guy who he's playing within his role, but is capable of more. At least when I watch him, that's my feeling, is like he's definitely capable of more, and I'm sure teams are aware of that. But I would say too, like, and not to get too much into the draft, but if I'm San Antonio and I do pursue, Nickeil Alexander-Walker or someone of a similar caliber, I would be interested in Malwatch or a guy like Derek Queen. Like those are guys who I think San Antonio, even if you draft them and they do end up playing a lot of minutes, I think you're fine with that, because I think even next season, you're not really worried about, are we winning a title and can these guys help us win a title this year? I don't think they're still quite in that territory. Though adding, De'Aaron Fox definitely accelerates the time. One thing I will say though is I don't know how interested both parties would be in re-signing Chris Paul. At least if it was from my perspective, I probably wouldn't be interested in bringing him back. Okay. And that's not to say he hasn't, served his role or served his purpose. He definitely has, but I think San Antonio has been at their best when they can push the pace a little bit. And I also know that one of the things with Chris Paul is that he doesn't intend to come off the bench. He doesn't want to come off the bench, and played him alongside of De'Aaron Fox. It has just been a little bit of they've been a little bit stuck in the mud offensively. Defensively, they're really, really small. That doesn't really help them at all. Makes life harder for Wembenyama. And then it also limits how much you can play Stephon Castle, because if San Antonio have, as they've kind of hinted out throughout the year and talked about throughout the year, if they really believe in him as this guy who can handle these ball handling responsibilities next to De'Aaron Fox, having Chris Paul out there, where do you find those reps for him? Where do you find the reps? So again, not that Chris Paul has not been good at what they asked him to do and that he hasn't lived up to what they asked him to do. He absolutely has, but I don't think if you're San Antonio, bringing back Chris Paul is a priority. And I think he's been fine. He has definitely been fine as far as like what you would expect for a 39-year-old point guard. But I think it's probably time to, hey, we got your 1-year rental. We want to see what Castle can do. We want to see what De'Aaron Fox can do, and we're willing to move on from that. But maybe they're thinking differently than I am. But that's just how I see the situation right now.
Okay, yeah. As far like I'm still kind of learning about what exactly Castle's supposed to be, because I when I first heard about him, I thought he was going to be like mainly like a point guard, and then as he starts progressing, and now he's like one of the leaders for Rookie of the Year. I'm saying he's like, I didn't know he was 6'6". So now I'm thinking, okay, maybe he's more like a combo guard. But do you think they would want him to be like also the primary lead point guard to back up Fox, like along with being like a someone who could play some two at times?
I think so. I'm very confused about like exactly what they saw in Stephon Castle. Not like what they saw in him as far as is he a good player? Does he deserve to be picked at 4? I think that's a bit to bed. But like he's not the greatest advantage creator, and he's not the best separator, and he's not a great pull-up shooter. At least not yet. And he hasn't really shown that. He didn't show that at UConn too much. There was a little bit of it in high school, but the high school game is significantly different from college and significantly different from the NBA. So they keep talking. The way they've talked about him and the way that he's talked about himself is that, yeah, like I'm a point guard. I want the ball in my hands. We trust him with the ball in his hands. We want to get him those reps. But watching him, I don't know if I see it, but it seems like with the way the team has spoke about him, and again, the way that Stephon Castle has talked about himself, I think they both certainly see him in that sort of vein to a degree. So I think getting him those reps, whether it's in the first unit alongside of, De'Aaron Fox, where he's not handling it as much, or even as that sixth man who is running the offense off the bench, I think that those are both things that could happen going forward. But again, I think a lot of this roster, I think they have good pieces, and I think they found some of their core, but a lot of the roles and responsibilities are sort of on the air. And I think also just like the presence of Chris Paul has put that up in the air a little bit, because Dev has also had to take a step back a little bit this year as far as what he has been asked to do with the ball in his hands. Steph Castle's role has fluctuated depending on Chris Paul's availability and his own availability. And then De'Aaron Fox, how much do you want the ball in his hands? How much do you want him initiating? There's a lot of things up in the air. So that's the only reason I mentioned, do they want to bring Chris Paul back?
I see.
But yeah, I think with Steph Castle, they definitely see at least a little bit of point guard in him.
So if they're gonna give him a lot more, give him a role where he's gonna be playing like a good amount of point guard, then they could, yeah, they probably don't need Chris Paul. They could probably get like a different guy, like they have Jordan McLaughlin right now. Not that he's in the rotation, but if you can just get like a minimum guy, then at that point, just someone who just get like a solid third stringer, that seems like that might be the move then for now, unless they can trade for somebody else. Okay, so I want to ask you about the rest of the core while we're already on it. So when the the Spurs rumors happened, I wasn't totally a fan of it at first, mainly because what it would probably take to acquire him right now, and also what his next contract would entail. I felt like they were better off waiting till next offseason. Presumably, once he's actually an expiring contract, then he's got a lot more control over the situation. But it turned out that that situation kind of got turbocharged into the trade deadline. So he was able to, use whatever leverage. Say, hey, let's here's where I want to be. Let's get this going. So now that the trade actually happened, I actually am more on board with it, because in my view, they kind of gave up next to nothing to get him.
Yeah.
Cause like the only really valuable pick they gave up to me is that Wolves 31 first.
Yeah.
And they didn't give up any of their top players on rookie deals or Devin Vassell. They still have what I think are like a lot of those other quality draft picks that we mentioned earlier. So now I like it a lot more, and it makes me a little more, just the fact that they kind of got him for free. Like I'm a little easier on the idea of what his next contract is going to be now, which is presumably going to be a max. But now that we know that for sure you have Wemby and you have Fox, how do you? Oh, okay, wrong question. But how do you feel about the deal in general? What they sent out, and about his upcoming, what's probably going to be a 4-year, $228 million extension?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about the extension. I think San Antonio will be able to figure it out. I mean, I'm not the biggest cap expert, but the cap continues to grow. And so I always feel like when you sign a deal, it looks a lot worse in the moment than it does when you look at like 2, 3, 4 years in the future, where it becomes, less and less and less of a percentage of the cap. I'm not that worried about that, but I did really like the deal just from the perspective of when we sort of saw things heat up on the trade rumor sort of mill. I thought that they were going to have to give up like Castle or Sochan or Castle and Sochan or Sochan and Vassell or like multiple picks or something like that. But with the leverage that Fox, I don't know how, but was able to create by just being like, I don't want to be here and I want to go to San Antonio. Like we've seen that with other players. I mean, Spurs fans are very well versed with that, where Kawhi was like, I'm not interested. It's a little bit different, obviously, the whole sitting out thing, but I want to go to an XYZ place. You're going to get me there. I'm not going to play. And then Kawhi got sent to Toronto and he had to wait a year. Like De'Aaron Fox got what he wanted pretty much immediately. And it didn't seem like there was a lot of pushback. And it somehow felt like San Antonio was still in the driver's seat. And then the deal gets done and you're like, oh, well, Castle's still here. Vassell's still here. Sohan's still here. They didn't really give up any major value picks. Like, it does feel like highway robbery. And so I'm very happy. And I'm sure Spurs, you could pull them and they'd be like, yeah, that was a tremendous deal. And for a lot of them, this was the first time that we might have seen on social media where fans were finally like, and Brian Wright finally did something. Because fans were not a huge supporter of Brian Wright. They kind of felt like, oh, he's just stockpiling all these picks and they're fine with tanking and you're wasting Wemby. And fans understandably wanted that, like, we want to win now. We want to, and to them, this was finally like, okay, not only did you not have to give up a lot of stuff, but now it kind of signals we're ready to win. So I think if you ask Spurs fans, they'd be very happy. But from my perspective as well, where I try to be a little less, less of a homer, less biased, I think it is still a good deal, a really good deal from that perspective.
Yeah, I think the process they went about this was correct, where in the end, like, you didn't really need to accelerate the timeline, because once you trade for Fox, you're making that like step. You're putting a lot of pressure on the young players to kind of now, hey, like, now you got to step up. We got to know if you're going to be a part of this group or not, because things are about to go fast. Usually you don't really want to do that if you don't have to. The expectations were kind of low, but since they didn't have to give up any of those players you mentioned, or really like too many valuable picks, yeah, then secure it now. Like like the Spurs rarely have a player of Fox's level interested in joining as a veteran in free agency or through trade. So for it to play out this way, yeah, it was a no brainer. And if as like when I as a cap analyst, when I look at what that deal is gonna be, yeah, I can like really nitpick it, and I don't feel too great about the idea of him getting a 30% max. He did. You can look at his 25% max. He definitely lived up to the value of that, but this time it's gonna take him into his 30s. How will he age into that? So is that like a guy? He's not like, at best he's like a top 20ish player. Is that someone you want to dedicate such a big chunk of your cap to? Like, so when you combine all these things, I don't feel too great about it. But just when you also consider that they kind of got him like as a free agent signing, in my view. Okay, you know what? Then it kind of changes the whole contractual aspect, where, okay, that like, if I don't, you almost got him for free, then okay, then that kind of goes with it. That's baked in. I feel a lot better about giving a max when you look at it with that context as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair way to look at it. And I think what you said is also fair. Like, guys who are super dependent on their athleticism, that blistering first step, the ability to get to the rim at will, create paint touches, break down a defense like that. Do they always age that well? No. And I think we saw that a little bit with Tony Parker, where it was like one day Tony Parker was getting into the paint and spinning and doing his teardrop and kicking it out. And then the next day it's like, oh, DeJounte Murray, who at the time, nobody knew he was going to be, fringe all-star level player, took his spot. Like, and now he's signing with Charlotte. It felt like it happened like that. But I don't know if I'm as worried, I guess, with Fox, because I feel like he does have a pretty good pull-up game. I think he is a pretty good ball handler. Like, he's still able to create separation. I am interested in what does happen as his athleticism starts waning, but how quickly does his athleticism wane? I think sports medicine and the way that they stretch these guys and have these guys on routines, and I think it's changed how guys age. I mean, obviously no one's LeBron. He's probably not going to, De'Aaron Fox is probably not going to look like this at 40, but we're talking about him heading into his 30s, his early 30s. So I'm not worried, but I think everything that you said is fair. Definitely fair.
Yeah, and Fox, I think he's a pretty high IQ player. can he change his game to offset that potential loss of athleticism? Can he improve his passing? Can he improve his shooting? I feel also pretty optimistic that he will be able to modify his game a little bit as he gets older to stay as effective. Maybe not quite as effective as his peak, but in a pretty high level, maybe like a different type of player as he gets into his early 30s. So, but yeah, so we know Fox and Wemby, they're for sure going to be a part of the Spurs for the foreseeable future. I'm sure you've been thinking about this a good amount now that the timeline has accelerated. But do you view anyone else as like a surefire part of the core? Do you have like maybe even a ranking of guys that you'd want to stick with the most?
I mean, I think if we had to tear him off, I think Castle. I I think he's a guy who you want to keep around for sure, and I think the Spurs feel that way. I mean, clearly they didn't give him up in Sacramento, and like the rumors were he was off limits, and lo and behold, the deal gets done, and he's still here. So I think he's probably number one on that list. Number two, I think I probably would still rank him above Sohan is Devin Vassell. I think he's still very useful. He's a guy who can score off ball. He's a pretty good shooter. He's had a down year this year. I think he's had a really tough time adjusting to his new role and his new sort of place in the pecking order, but I still think he's a very valuable player. He's a good team defender. He's been looking better recently with less offensive responsibilities, though now more has been put on his plate. Then number three, I would probably say Jeremy Sohan. He's a guy who I like, but he's in that tier of like if you need to trade him to get a deal done or if you need to trade him to make money work or something, then I don't think he's off limits. I really like him. I think he's a really solid defender. I think he's very fluid positionally as far as defense goes, but he doesn't create for himself. He's not a shooter. He's not a pull-up shooter. He's not a ball handler. He's not a playmaker. And he's a guy who, when you've asked him in the past to create off the dribble and get to the rim, he can't finish at the rim off of his own handle. He's not really driving and kicking guys in good shots. I think he's pretty expendable. I think you can find guys like him. I would say if you're looking in the draft, if for some reason you needed to trade Sohan this summer, you could probably replace him with someone like a Colin Murray Boyles. Like they are very similar, though. I think Colin probably has a little bit better ball handling, and I think he's got more feel for the game. So he's a guy who I'd like to keep around, but he's not essential. And then last but not least, Keldon Johnson. I think he's in the middle of a hot streak right now, so I'm sure Spurs fans probably don't love me saying this, and they've been very defensive of Keldon over the years, but not a great defender, very streaky player, career low from three this season, doesn't pull up from mid-range. He's a guy who I think if you can keep him around, great. I think he's great for morale. He's a leader. He's one of those like kind of guys who's the tissue of the team, who really keeps guys together off the court, and he's getting things together like get-togethers for players, and he mentors guys. But as far as what he brings on the court, I think he's fairly expendable. So those are the only four guys I really see as like they could be core players. Everyone else, though, like the Mamukalashvilis, the Bassies, the Champinis, they can come and go, and they will. I mean, you see with every team, there's a lot of roster turnover. But as far as those four other core guys, so to speak, I think Castle and Vassell are maybe the only ones who you probably really want to keep around. And then, Sohan is one of the guys, hey, I'd like to keep around.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you on their perception on Castle. For a lot of people, your mileage might vary on what kind of player Castle is going to become with his limitations, especially shooting wise. But it seems like he is the most coveted non-Wemby prospect the Spurs have had in recent years, and especially this early on. Yeah, they're not going to want to move on from him, but definitely just based on how they've operated over the past years, they really like their guys. They've stuck with all of them
Yeah.
throughout their whole rookie deals, starting with Vassell, I think was like the first one in 2020. And yeah, like they've kept all these, even though Keldon Johnson in 2019, they've stuck through him as well. So I'm sure they're gonna want to keep him to see things through at least through next season for sure. Everyone else though, I kind of get the feeling that, especially now that things have accelerated, the clock's ticking on a lot of these guys. Now Vassell, it's a little different because he's on a really nice deal. I think that's like a very good value deal. He's like locked in, making like 27 a year over the next the life of the deal, and I think there's some like kind of decreases again at some point. It's strange, kind of unique structure, but he's a guy where I think if you can get like a significant upgrade, particularly at the wing, and we can get into that a little later. Okay, then I think you. At this point, based on what we've seen, I don't think he's anyone that like you can, he's not like 100% untouchable, but I think that's like a guy you want to keep. They don't really have anyone else quite like him. And then, Sochan might as well. Well, Keldon Johnson, I think, he's definitely like pretty expendable. He's not really like even like, he's kind of like gotten past that age curve. Like he's past his rookie deal. But then I might as well get into my next question. This would be, because then we can get into Sochan a little more. Because the 2022 draft class, they select Sochan. Very tough. And I want to get into like his extension, because he's going to be extension eligible this summer. The other top extension candidate on the Spurs other than Fox. And he's a guy like, he's really tough for me to evaluate, not only as a player, but like what are like contractual comparisons. I really don't know what his next deal is going to look like. It's really tough. Because when you look at just like pull up Basketball Reference, look at his stats, it's kind of the same things every year. So like I don't watch the Spurs enough to know exactly how he's progressed. Like he's definitely a rotation player, but I'm not sure like where he'll be beyond that, or like what's on that trajectory. And then when you look past, this also a draft that they turned Derek White into the pick that became Blake Wesley. They traded Thaddeus Young to move up in the draft to select Malachi Branham. And I'm not sure if and how they slot into the Spurs now that they're heading towards competing. With Sochan, I think he's very much like, he's not like, they're not shopping him around, but I'm sure, especially given the extension situation, his contract situation, if the right deal came along, I think they won't hesitate to move him. But with that in mind, have you thought about what his next extension might look like a figure in mind for him? And do you even think he gets extended at all? And also, in regards to Blake and Wesley, Malachi Branham and Blake Wesley, what do you think is going to happen to them as they approach the end of their deals?
Yeah, I guess we can start with those two guys because I'll keep it kind of short and sweet. I like Malachi Branham for like a little spark plug off the bench, but really hasn't gotten a ton of run. And I think it kind of speaks volumes to what they think about him right now. They've assigned him to the Austin Spurs, and that's even with a very shorthanded roster. Like they want to see him get on the court and do something. Blake Wesley, they've given him a little bit more run. They like his defensive intensity. A lot of the guys on the roster spoke really highly of him over the summer. And even Coach Pop, before he went to the sidelines, and now Coach Mitch Johnson, anytime they get a chance to speak about him or they're asked about him, they're like, we love his energy. We think he's so great defensively. He pushes the pace. But that's pretty much it. He's not a great shooter. He brings energy, but it's like sometimes misplaced defensively. And so I think both of those guys probably don't get extended. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're not back. Sochan, I think, is definitely a guy who they really like. I think he's going to get extended. Now, what that number looks like, I do not know. That is something that I have asked myself a lot over the last couple of weeks, over the last year or so even too, because he's a really interesting player, but he doesn't necessarily excel in any one area outside of maybe the defensive end. He's a guy who they've thrown him on a lot of guys and a lot of different positions, and they've thrown him on a lot of star players, whether it's Anthony Edwards or Kawhi Leonard or a Paul George or a Jason Tatum. Like, he's definitely got some lockdown defender in him when he's playing against these bigger wings or forwards. But yeah, I just don't know how much you can value that when you look on the other end. And he's really just a play finisher. He's not a guy who gets other guys the ball. And as much as they have asked, Jimmy Barron, their new shooting coach, like, hey, let's work with this guy. Let's reform his shot. The hitch is still there. The reluctancy to shoot is still there. The percentage is still very low. Like unless he can become at least a respectable standstill shooter where he doesn't shrink the floor, how do you ever play him next to Castle? And how if you can't play him next to Castle, how often does he get on the floor? If he can't get on the floor that much, how much can you give him? So if I had to guess, and maybe I might be highballing or lowballing here, I'm not sure, but maybe in that 15 to 18 million range, somewhere in there. But I don't know. I mean, I'd love to get an idea of what you think, but it is so hard to pin that down, especially for someone as unique and uniquely flawed and skilled as Sochan is.
So I kind of have like a rough idea because there really is like very hard, like there's really no comparison. I'm really trying to find, especially like a player like him that was selected as high in the draft as he was. Because the high end hope for him is that he can become like a Draymond or an Aaron Gordon. And I just don't
Yeah.
see that. I don't think he's close to any of that. I think the closest modern comparison I could kind of think of is a bigger Josh Hart. Uh, but like not
Sure.
even as like where Hart can be streaky. Like I don't think Sohan has really had like any type of like shot like that, and not nearly as effective. So I don't think he's gonna get paid like Josh Hart. I'm just trying to think of like what is like the kind of I'm trying to see like who he might turn out to be like. Um, and as far as what like an extension would look like right now, I would guess it might be closer to the full mid level, kind of like so like around 14 mil a year, something like that. We've seen players get those types of deals recently. Usually, if that's all you're gonna get offered, then you don't extend at all. But we've seen guys like Okongwu, he got basically that. Denny Avdia got that. They both got that 2 years ago, and then and then even before that, Grant Williams kind of got that, not as an extension, but as a free agent. So I'm thinking that's kind of what he's looking at as an extension now at the higher end, especially. And we'll get into this next, but that's especially because they still want to try to maximize some cap flexibility for 2026 because they still have a window to do something else there. So what they do with him will factor into that. I kind of get the feeling that he won't get extended. They won't come to an agreement on anything. Um, and that he might want to try to push for something more. We'll see. I don't know. That's just kind of speculative on my part. I don't know what they're thinking. And then, yeah, as far as Malachi and Wesley, I think the team is just kind of, especially now that they're ready to compete, the team's just kind of outgrown them. They're still developing. And as I look at their depth chart for next year, they're probably not going to play when you
No.
look at what they've already got. So at this point, yeah, they're not going to get extended, I don't think. And at this point, they're probably just, like their salaries will probably be useful for some potential trades for next season. See what might come available to help fill out the rest of the needs on their bench.
Yeah, and I think that's the perfect way to look at this. Like my podcast co-host Gabe and I always say, like the train is leaving the station, and not everybody's going to make it. Not everybody's going to get on board. And unfortunately, I think fans get really attached to certain players, and it's like you want to see the guys who get drafted stick with the team and make a career with the team. But I mean, you look at the team, and that's just so often not the case. Like there really is just so much roster turnover. Not everybody's going to make it. And like a lot of these guys, it's not even that they're not going to make it with this team. They may not even be in the NBA in a few years, right? Like I'm sure Thunder fans at a certain point thought like Theo Maledon was going to be a guy who was going to be around for a while, and now what? He's not. He's not a part of that roster. He's not in the NBA anymore. So yeah, those kind of guys, they come and go. They come and go, and then you forget about them because your team, XYZ first round picks over the next year. So I hate to say it because they're awesome dudes, and they hustle and they don't pout when they don't play, but that's their job. They got to do their job, and San Antonio has a job to do too.
And I'm sure some Spurs fans are bummed that Derek White turned into Blake Wesley, and he's probably out of the plan. But they still have that Celtic swap in 28 to potentially look forward to. So the trade's not dead yet. There still might be something else coming in the pipeline.
And a
Yeah,
necessary evil too, right? Like, when you trade Derek White and you traded DeJounte Murray, you did it with the thought process that like you might have a chance to get a Victor Wembanyama, and you got him. So, a necessary evil to get what you got to get.
right. All right, Noah. So let's get into the last thing. I want to try to look extra ahead. So I wrote about this on Third Apron about like how the Spurs can still have some cap space in 2026 despite presumably extending Fox to a max deal to go after somebody else. So they still don't have like max cap space as things stand. So let's say they extend Fox, he starts at like 51 million. They still need to do a couple things like potentially get off a guy like Keldon Johnson or Devin Vassell and not extend Jeremy Sohan or keep it at like a pretty cheap amount. Then they could get in the mix. They wouldn't have max cap space, but now they're not going to get anyone in free agency. The whole point now it's the reason they were able to get Fox is because they had the credible threat of outright signing him in 2026. So
Yeah.
the Kings had to get off him now. So they can do that again and then force a trade with if there's another player who wants to go to the Spurs. So like I said, they still have a lot of good quality picks. Those swaps we mentioned, the Hawks pick in 2027, Hawks swap next year. I would guess that's gonna convey. And up to 3 of their own, which those probably are going to be the least valuable ones. I would
Yeah.
guess teams are expecting the Spurs to be pretty good in the next 5 to 6 years. And they still have Devin Vassell, Jeremy Sohan, Stephon Castle. We already touched on those guys. So depending on who becomes available, you combine all that. I think that they have enough to get just about anybody who would want to go there. And I think Fox is just the tip of the iceberg of players who's going to want to play with Wemby. And especially now that Fox is there, I think we'll see at least one other all-star level player try to position himself to go there. So do you have any pipe dream in mind? Is there anyone that you deem even reasonably gettable, even unreasonably gettable, that you would want to add to this nucleus?
Yeah, and again, this is you said it like pipe dream maybe, but Kevin Durant would be fantastic. I would love to see him link up with Wembanyama, not only because I think it would be a really nice on-court product, but I think Wemby's talked about him as a guy who he's idolized. He's watched his game, he's molded his game a little bit after him, and I think he could learn a lot from him as well. But I just think that would be such a fun combination on the court. Now, to get a Kevin Durant, you'd have to give up a lot, even at the later stages of his career now. But if you have the opportunity to get a Kevin Durant, you do it. I think if you're San Antonio and that is a realistic, achievable trade, I think you do it. But I other than him, and I hate to do this thing where I throw multiple players out from one team like I did with Alexander Walker and Naz Reid, but also like a Devin Booker, because I have no idea where the Suns are going. I have no idea what they want to do. I don't know that they are gonna win it. I'm not gonna say I don't know. They're not gonna win a title anytime soon. And I know they probably don't want to give up either of those guys right now. But at a certain point, I think they got to look themselves in the mirror and be like, what do we do next? How do we reload? And San Antonio has a lot of assets. So if they're able to do something to get either of those guys, because I think Devin Booker fits in beautifully. He's a guy who we've seen him play a little bit of point guard. We've seen him be a more off-ball shooter, scorer, coming off screens, but also running some secondary reps as a ball handler. That could work very easily next to a De'Aaron Fox and a Victor Wembanyama. So he's another guy who I think, yeah, I'd love to have him in silver and black. But those two guys, for me, they would be top of the priority list. Do you have any in mind?
So I circled one of those guys. I circled Booker. I think that's definitely someone I would think can be reasonably attainable. Not now. First, they'll trade Durant, and they'll try to see how things go with Booker, and then if things don't work out, then I could see them that be the next shoe to drop. I think Durant's actually very attainable for the Spurs. And I think Durant would that'd probably be a situation that would definitely interest him. Because when you look at some of the other teams that are being thrown in the mix for him. Like, okay, the Warriors probably not now unless it's like for Draymond Green and some stuff. I don't. That one I think is gonna be a little tough to work. I don't really see Houston wanting to do that, but then there's like Miami. I don't really think Minnesota makes sense. Dallas might be like the one team I think might make the most sense at this point. I think they can get it done. I think it's more like if the Spurs would want to bring him in, because I think if I'm the Spurs, I would try to get someone who fits the timeline a little better with Fox.
That makes sense.
You can, because if you're bringing in Kevin Durant, you got to win the championship like
right now.
immediately.
Yeah.
Because he's almost, he's been able to extend his prime for so long. Him, Curry, and LeBron, but you also never know. He had that Achilles injury. You never know how long he could stay at this level. But I think they have the stuff to make the Suns a reasonable offer to accept. I think it's just up to the Spurs if that's something they'd want to do. But for Kevin Durant, I think he'd love to play with Wemby and Fox. Like no brainer. I think he would. That's a great situation for him. So yeah, Devin Booker. That's someone I definitely think like I kind of just already touched on it. Like once they presumably trade Durant, if things don't work out after around what they have left with Booker, then yeah, I think that the Spurs could be, if they're interested in him, have one of the best packages to get him. If you combine just about everything that they have, it probably then they'd really have to get into their chest, because unlike Fox, Booker has like 3 years left on his deal and he could extend this summer. That is something I'd also keep an eye on the Suns. Maybe they want to do that to potentially raise his value in a trade. But then the other guy, and then like in the same vein as Booker, I put Jaylen Brown just with the Celtics situation, just in case, with the ownership, who knows? I don't think they'll trade him, but if let's say like what he does become the cap casualty, which I doubt, I think they'd probably move Kristaps or Holiday first. I think that would be a pretty great fit for the Spurs. Not as good as Booker, but I think that'd be pretty good. If that's a guy the Spurs want, I think they could make that happen. And also, not necessarily a wing, but it does feel natural that we look at wings. Larry Markkinen, I'm sure he's going to be a guy who is going to potentially be in rumors again now that he will become trade eligible. If the Spurs want someone with a little more size to complement Wemby, I think that could be a pretty nice addition. So those were just a couple guys. Obviously, so none of those guys are going to be free agents in 2026. So it's not like the type of situation where the Spurs can like the Fox situation, not like that. And they're not going to have cap space in 2027. And I just bring that up because Jokic and Giannis could have player options that year. And I think while that is like the pipe dream of pipe dreams, then Wemby will have started his next deal, in which case, okay, Fox and Wemby on max deals, you're out of it. Like you can only trade for whoever it is at this point.
Yeah.
But I don't think any of these names are unreasonable. I think that just when you look at what they have and the allure of their nucleus, like I said, I think Fox was the tip of the iceberg, and I think there's going to be they'll have a good position to bring in another guy. Just about who is that player who wants to join. I feel like that's kind of where the Spurs are going to operate. Like, okay, who wants to come here? Do we think he'd be a good fit? Done.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think that's one of the exciting things if you're a San Antonio Spurs fan, or even if you're someone covering the team, like as a member of the media, that the success that they seem to be lined up for, it almost feels like you can't miss. There are very few scenarios I see in which, as long as everyone's healthy, as long as people progress how they're supposed to progress, and as long as you don't make a insanely, idiotic move, you should be very good for a very long time, and you should be in a position to win at least one title, if not multiple, at Wemby's peak. So I think that's what is so exciting about this team. But yes, I agree with you. I don't think that anyone is necessarily off limits, because I do think soon we will see guys positioning themselves, as you already mentioned, to find a way to get to the 2-0 and play with Wemby. And I think if I was a superstar player or an all-star player, I'd be doing the same thing too. I mean, that to me seems like your biggest, easiest ticket to success. So yeah, very, very happy with the direction this team is going in right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and especially for Fox, like I think that was just brilliant for him to position himself to go to this specific team. Like you don't see that too much. Like it's usually the same types of teams. It's like no, like smallish market team. They have this guy. I got to get there before someone else does. Because yeah, I think there's going to be a line. Not like I don't know how big a line, but there's gonna be a couple other players wanting to get that slot, like to be there and get paid properly. Uh, I think Fox he was proactive on that and it worked out for him. All right,
Yeah,
well,
yeah, absolutely.
that's about everything. That's all I got. Noah, thank you for joining me. You were my third guest. I'm starting to get to the flow of things. I'm really enjoying this. A lot of fun. And so, like I said, you can see on the overlay, you can follow Noah on Twitter and Blue Sky. On Twitter, it's N_Magaro. I have his Blue Sky link in the description. And I've got the link to Vic and Roll, his newsletter and podcast, in the description as well. Make sure to subscribe to that, support Noah. Noah, do you have anything in the pipeline coming up we should be looking forward to?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to be working on a video here pretty soon, looking at some of the sets and plays that the Spurs have been running for De'Aaron Fox and what they can hopefully look forward to next season. I know that he's done for the rest of this season. It's something that I started about a week ago, so we'll see. He's not going to be on the court anymore, but I'm excited to get into that. I'm excited for Spurs fans to kind of get a preview, what they can look forward to seeing next year once everybody's healthy and ready to go. But thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed talking about the Spurs, their future outlook, some of the cap stuff. So again, thank you for bringing me on.
You're welcome. Thank you for being on. Make sure to look out for that film study, everyone. And yeah, for everyone else still here, thanks for watching. You can listen to this on it'll be on the all the podcast providers, Spotify, Apple, all that. Make sure you're subscribed to me on YouTube. It's my name, Yossi Goslin. Follow me for salary cap analysis, transaction analysis on Twitter and Blue Sky at Yossi Goslin. And I will probably be back later this week. So